Human beings have inflicted untold suffering on each other since the dawn of time. Over the centuries, people have worked to devise constantly evolving forms of punishment and coercion. You're probably familiar with a lot of different punishments, from detention to jail time. In the past, you may have even heard of cruel punishments like hanging, burning, and stoning. Despite how horrible they were, people have devised even more perverse and awful methods of punishing those who were accused of wrongdoing throughout history. The rat dungeon. This form of punishment struck paralyzing fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. This was a prison that was located at the bottom of the London Tower, where prisoners were shackled and chained in complete darkness. But here's the thing, the dungeon was connected to the nearby river and just below the river's waterline, so that when the water levels rose, all the rats that lived along the riverbed would be pushed out of their shelters and forced to swim downstream. This would, of course, lead the hungry and angry rats towards the entrance of the dungeon, where they would then come face to face with the prisoner. But to the unlucky prisoner, he never actually saw anything, and all he would hear were the soft scurries of the rats' feet entering the dungeon. And in a matter of minutes, these soft noises were in the hundreds, and all around him, these angry and aggressive rats would then begin to take small bites from the prisoner who had no way of defending himself. Now, he might be able to shake the rats off for a few hours, but eventually the prisoner would pass out from pure exhaustion. And while he slept, the rats would continue to take bites from his flesh. Eventually, when he would wake up, he would discover hundreds of bites throughout his entire body. But it didn't stop there. The prisoner was left here for days or weeks on end, depending on his crime. But towards the end of the medieval period, this form of punishment just got more and more deranged, eventually becoming a for execution where prisoners would just be thrown in the dungeon and forgotten about. White torture. Firstly, we must first comprehend solitary imprisonment in order to comprehend white torture. Prisoners are commonly subjected to solitary confinement, a type of punishment that entails keeping them in a tiny cell with no access to other people or activities. Solitary confinement is used in the US to punish conduct ranging from serious offenses like inciting fights to minor ones like leaving extra toilet paper rolls in your cell. The majority of solitary cells are smaller than a typical automobile, measuring about 6 by 9 feet. Remember that this incarceration might endure for days, weeks, or months, causing severe psychological harm and misery. Humans are social creatures by nature, so when our brains aren't given stimuli, they frequently create them. Hallucinations, psychosis, melancholy, nightmares, disassociation from your body, and even physical discomfort and nausea are all known side effects of prolonged solitary confinement. One night I heard someone screaming far away, then I realized it was me, remarked an inmate who had been kept in solitary confinement for 23 days. It's difficult to imagine, but while the term white torture can mean any psychological torture in general, the meaning here is more literal. White torture is a type of sensory deprivation in which a prisoner's cell, clothes, and even food are entirely white, from the bed to the toilet and even the victim's clothes. Bright lights are positioned in such a way as to eliminate as many shadows as possible and make the victim feel as though they are trapped in a white void. Guards wear all white, lights are kept on 24 hours a day, and no words are spoken. No color is seen. It was documented in the case of Amir Fakhravar, who was arrested in his native Iran and subjected to white torture for some 8 months in 2004. While the physical pain of sensory deprivation is minimal compared to other tortures on this list, the psychological damage is beyond compare. Fakhravar was quoted as saying when he was released, he was not a normal person anymore and could no longer remember even the faces of his parents. Yikes. Sack punishment. Have you ever found yourself in a tight place with an unpleasant person? Perhaps you and that one obnoxious co-worker shared an elevator. It's usually worse, though, because that obnoxious co-worker can also be a poisonous, furious snake. The victim was placed inside a sizable canvas sack as part of the ancient Roman poena culae, also known as the punishment of the sack. At this stage, the sack would be flung into a river, followed by the tossing of a dog, cat, monkey, rooster, and snake into the same sack. Poena culae's theory was that the terrified and hostile creatures inside the bag would rip one another to shreds as the water steadily filled it up, leaving the poor victim trapped in the center. Because you could utilize an additional rooster instead of wasting a perfectly good monkey, different creatures were put into the bag for different punishments. Those accused of parricide, the crime of killing one's parents, were most frequently subjected to this cruel punishment. It doesn't seem like a particularly ironic or appropriate punishment to kill your parents, so I'm not really clear why it would land you in the danger bag. Nevertheless, this barbaric punishment fell out of style in the 3rd century CE in Rome. Drawing and quartering is one of the most infamous methods of cruel and unusual punishment. It's still difficult to believe it's an actual thing that was conceived by actual humans and happened to punish unfortunate souls. The punishment was first doled out in England in the 13th century. The accused was drawn, tied to a horse and dragged to the gallows, and then usually hanged, maybe disemboweled or beheaded. Afterward, the condemned was quartered, i.e., had his body split in quarters, sometimes by tying each limb to a different horse and having them run in opposite directions. This punishment was reserved for those guilty of treason and was abolished in 1867. Chinese water torture, and how it drove victims insane. Chinese water torture may not sound particularly grueling, but history begs to differ. While the historical record on Chinese water torture is lacking, it was first described in the late 15th or early 16th century by Hippolytus de Marsilius. The Bologna, Italy native was a successful lawyer, but he is best known for being the first to document the method that is today known as Chinese water torture. Legend has it that de Marsilius devised the idea after noticing how the continuous dripping of water upon stone eventually eroded away parts of the rock. He then applied this method to humans. Medieval torture devices typically used razor-sharp blades, ropes, or blunt instruments to pry confessions from subjects. Chinese water torture was more insidious. It was a form of punishment and interrogation that involves restraining someone's arms and legs before placing a bucket full of water above their head while slowly dripping cold water on their face, forehead, or scalp. The bucket has a small pinprick-sized hole in the bottom that drips water onto the victim at regular intervals. The victim is usually positioned so the drops hit them on the forehead, which, along with your fingertips, is one of the most sensitive areas of the body. While this may not sound so bad at first, it could last for weeks. As the process goes on, it becomes more and more maddening, as it could last for days. The splash of water was jarring, and the victim experiences anxiety while trying to anticipate the next drop. The Chinese water torture method certainly was effective in getting prisoners to confess. He believed the restraints used to hold victims down were responsible for making prisoners break, rather than the water itself. The Iron Maiden. Depending on the source, it is typically described as an upright wooden or metal box with sharp blades, spikes, or nails inside. It is frequently referred to as an Egyptian sarcophagus, a device with a human silhouette, or a cylindrical casing with a mask shaped like a woman's head on top. The device's most popular variant is the latter, which is how it gained its name. The victim or offender endured agony after being put within the apparatus and having the door shut. The mechanism of the Iron Maiden has been described in a variety of ways. In one variation, the condemned was placed in a vertical sarcophagus studded with spikes or blades. The lid would then slowly and smoothly close, forcing the person to move backward and press against the blades on the back side as the blades penetrated from the front. This process went on until the sarcophagus was fully closed, at which point it was left closed for a while to allow the man, or what remained of him, to bleed out. According to some historians, the second version of the Iron Maiden is the first instance of an execution tool with a pressure mechanism. The Nabis dynasty created this variation in ancient Sparta. The instrument was a female statue with the face of a lega dotted with nails along the arms and chest. Legend has it that this kind of Iron Maiden was not shaped like a sarcophagus, but rather had the image of Nabis's wife, Alega. When the monarch made the decision to put someone to death, the instrument was carried into the hall. The condemned person was positioned in front of it, and the statue's arms were then spread. In order to get the Iron Maiden to embrace the victim, Nabis personally stood behind her and applied pressure to her back, driving the nails deeper and deeper into the guilty person's skin. But rather than being a practical tool, the Iron Maiden is seen as a myth. Since the earliest known example of this tool was allegedly made only in the 16th century, there is no reliable information regarding its use, and the fortress's basement, where it was located, was destroyed during World War I. Many historians believe that information regarding the use of a tool like the Iron Maiden was invented around the 16th and 18th centuries. The Iron Maiden specimens that we currently see in museums are only approximate representations of what this design might have looked like if it had been in use and existed in antiquity. The Judas Cradle. Just to look at this pyramid-shaped device is enough to make you wince. In medieval times, the threat of it alone could inspire people to confess to whatever the torturers wanted. The victim would be perched above the Judas Cradle, also known as the Judas Chair, and lowered, often by ropes, onto the spiky top. Their weight eventually forced the tip of the pyramid into their body, causing it to rip through the pelvis. There is much evidence in historical accounts that though this device varied in design, it was used across medieval Europe, but has been most associated with the Spanish Inquisition. Oh wow, those were definitely some crazy punishments. That's it for today. Remember to support, please subscribe. See you in the next one.